stuck here. The cops won't bother me. So, I'm gonna take it out for a quick spin. Look at this car. Wow. That's a McLaren. I don't think he's seen Ninja 250 power come up on him. Yeah, there he is in front of me. Look at that. That's an awesome looking McLaren. Wow. That's funny. Look, I'm keeping up with a McLaren. I've seen a few, you know, there's a lot of people with money. But man, that looks fantastic. Wow. I can't believe my Ninja 250 is keeping up with a McLaren. Look at that, that's so awesome. Wow. I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about this Ninja 250, the way it rides. I've given you a little bit of an overview of the Ninja 250, and I've always thought that these were great bikes. And you cannot go wrong with a Ninja 250, guys. If you're looking for a starter bike, man, these bikes make crazy good bikes. This thing is so economical. For $5 you can fill up the gas tank and ride for 250 miles. I mean, that's a lot of fun you can have. You have a very basic bike. We're kind of neglecting all of these things about these bikes, about being simple, because everybody thinks that having all of these modes and all of these complex systems is good for motorcycles. But to me, having a motorcycle, the beauty is that I can fix it up myself. I don't have to rely on a mechanic. The downside that I neglected to mention, so because this bike is not very powerful, and if I ride with a bunch of guys on 600s, one of the common things that people do on 600s, and especially with group thinking, is that they constantly are passing cars. Even in the country roads, you're like passing cars left and right. But on the Ninja 250, you have to kind of think about it. You have to think about when you're going to be passing, because you need a lot more space to pass that car. You can't just like roll the throttle and pass a car because you have so much more power. On the Ninja 250, you have to kind of think about it. You have to think about the distance that you can pass, and then you have to downshift quite a bit to get up to speed. And that has been an issue with like group riding, because the guys who are riding 600s, they're just like passing cars left and right, and they're not even thinking about the people behind, because it's so much easier for them to go fast in a straight line. It's like a 600cc bike has got way more power than a car. But if a car is moving at 70 miles an hour and you want to pass it, you're not going to pass it on the Ninja 250. In the twisties, this bike is perfect. And I'm not really going too fast, but in any sort of like twisty condition, this is where the bike really shines. I don't know, in a way I feel like I would rather take this bike to the track or to trailer to a twisty area, because it's such a fun bike for the twisties, but it's torture on the highway. Look at that. I think that's a hog. Yeah, you know, one of the things that's kind of annoying is that a lot of people just think that the people that buy 250s are these beginners that don't know any better. And in a way, there is a really big Ninja 250 community, but if you take a Ninja 250 to a dealership, I always feel like they take advantage of you a little bit more, because they assume you don't know any better. And you see a lot of people asking in Ninja 250 forums, it's like, oh, I got to do the 600-mile interval or the 1,000-mile interval. That's something that you do when you don't know about bikes, but generally all of those things are just visual checkups. You never stop learning. And a lot of people, they think they can ride it as fast as the bike is capable, and they're very wrong, because no one really can. At least no one that's average. Maybe like somebody that's a very talented rider could, but most people are not that good. I think what happens a lot in motorcycling is that every guy and woman likes to think that they're better than they actually are, and including me, I think. No one is really that good at riding. Everybody likes to think they're somehow strong for riding a motorcycle. Look, if your body hits a guardrail, you're not going to feel that strong. So that's the way you should kind of live your life. This is my third Ninja 250, and it's such a good bike. The first Ninja 250 that I bought was a 2008 Ninja 250, exactly like this, same color, and I put 87,000 miles on it. That was incredible. And I bought it mainly because I wanted to commute on it, because this thing gets 70 to 75 miles to the gallon. And that was very enticing when you consider you can get a bike that looks as good as this, gets 70 miles to the gallon, and you can travel 250 miles per tank. That's the same range that my FJR 1300 had. The FJR actually had less range than this when I think about it. It's got a decent gas tank. You can ride for miles and miles. It's very reliable. There are some pros and cons with this bike, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about it. Kawasaki has made the Ninja 250 since the 80s, and they stopped making the old school Ninja 250 in 2007. So from the 80s to 2007, it looked like a very square mini like Kawasaki Concours. It was more touring oriented, and it was an excellent bike. There was nothing wrong with it, and I actually owned one. I bought this one in 2008, and I put 87,000 miles, and eventually I decided to buy the previous. I bought a 2002 Ninja 250, and I really liked that one because it was more comfortable for the highway, and the engine was easier to work on. This one, the valves are much more complex because it uses shims. So if you're a home mechanic, using this sort of system to do valves, it's much more time consuming. So that's something to consider if you're thinking about buying a Ninja 250. But this is a 250cc. It's one of the smallest sport bikes you can possibly get. And you might think, why would I want a 250cc? You know, everybody else rides 600s, 1000s. There's something to be said about these little Ninja 250s. So the weight of this bike is only 374 pounds. And it might seem like a lot, but because of the small engine and there's like very little rotational mass, it feels much lighter than it is. And there are GSXR 750s that are around 400 pounds, but when you ride those, it feels much heavier. And if you're using this just to kind of like ride around the countryside, this thing almost feels like a bicycle because it's got such low weight, and you can just throw it into corners, and it doesn't have a lot of power. So if you're a new rider, you're not going to get in trouble with the power this thing has. This only has about 29 horsepower and about 21 pounds of torque. And the way this thing makes power is like really high in the rev range. So in a way, starting out on a Ninja 250 is actually much better than a 600, 1000 or anything, because it makes you choose the right gear so you can ride properly in the right gear, in the right RPMs. It teaches you a lot more about riding than a 600 or 1000. You can kind of mess up on a 600, be in the wrong gear, but if you're in the wrong gear on this, you lose a lot of momentum, and then you're not going to be able to like move properly. A lot of ADV bikes are kind of like lazy bikes. You can put it in third gear and just ride, you know, a twisty road. But this one, you really have to work it. So in a way, it rewards you for riding fast because you have to be a much better rider to ride this thing fast. But it also teaches you like the skills that you need to get into a 600 and ride it properly and very well. It's a very light bike, 370 something pounds, and only 29 horsepower. And these things in the aftermarket sell for, you know, $2,000, $3,000. The good thing about buying one of these in the used market is that you can buy it for $2,000. A year or two later, you can sell it for $2,000 because there's always a demand for this type of bike because there's always new riders coming into the market. This one in particular is an important bike for Kawasaki because Kawasaki made this kind of, you can say, kind of ugly bikes, ugly square bikes until 2007, and then they released this, which is the Ninjet, the new Ninja 250R, and it became a much better looking sport bike, and it kind of rekindled a lot of the small sport bike craze that was happening. Motorcycles were getting way too big, way too heavy, and now we're starting to see that again with motorcycles. They're getting big and heavy, and they have a lot of electronics and a lot more issues than these have. This one from 2010 is still carbureted, and it's kind of insane that you think about this bike still being carbureted. If you didn't know anything about motorcycles, you would think that this Kawasaki Ninja 250 was a much bigger bike. It looks fantastic, and most people looking at it will think it's a 600 at the very least. It's when they start poking around a little bit, and once they find out it's a 250, they go like, oh yeah, it looks small. But in reality, physically, it looks much bigger because Kawasaki decided to flare out a lot of the plastics, so it's bigger than it actually is. If I was to remove the plastics, you would see that there's a lot of space in the engine and everything. This gives it a better look because it looks bigger, and oftentimes people don't want to get 250s because they think somehow it's too slow or it doesn't look great, but this new redesign of the Ninja 250 made the bike look much more like a sport bike. It's got a very aggressive Ninja 250 headlight. It actually resembles a lot of the Kawasaki Ninjas, of course. It's an angular sort of look. It's a little bit menacing, but not too menacing. And the dual headlights do look good, but I think a lot of people now are moving towards the single headlights. Things about this bike is that it uses 17-inch wheels. The previous Ninja 250 used 16-inch, and it was a little bit difficult to get rubber for it. The good thing about this new Ninja 250 with the bigger wheels is that it handles better. You cannot deny that this 250 handles better. It's got a little bit better suspension, but a lot of it has to do with the wheel size. The old Ninja 250 had the 16, so it was a little bit smaller. It didn't really affect a lot of the handling, but when you ride the twisties, you can definitely tell that this one is a little bit more agile. So up front here, you have a really nice rotor, and I like that the rotor is warped like this. It's a nice touch by Kawasaki to do that. Before, in the old Ninja 250s, they all had the regular disc brakes, and there was nothing particularly bad with it, but this just looks so much better. And of course, you do have 17-inch wheels up front, and that makes handling much better, and so many more choices to get tires for this bike than the previous Ninja 250. On this section, you have your factory exhaust, and one of the things a lot of people do is get aftermarket exhaust, but I've always been in the thought that inline twos or parallel twos, whatever you want to call them, they don't sound good no matter what. And I think a lot of times when people put aftermarket exhausts on their two-cylinder bikes like Yamaha Tenreis, Africa Twins, they don't sound very good. And this bike does not sound that good, especially idling. When you're revving this bike a lot, it sounds pretty good from a distance, but it's not like a V-twin sound that sounds really great. The transmission is always smooth. There's never any issues with engines and transmissions in these Kawasaki's. The cool thing about the transmission and the ratios, you can actually play around with the ratios. You can gear them higher for highway, gear them lower for city riding, or you can just leave it as stock. But it's a 6-speed transmission, so it's a 6-speed 250cc liquid cool 250cc engine. It's kind of crazy that it gives you this much, and it's a parallel twin, so it gives you a lot for your money. When you sit on this bike, you'll notice that the position of it, you see my legs kind of slightly bent backwards, but it's a very comfortable position. It's not like a real sport bike position. Normally on a sport bike, it's even like further back, but it's a very comfortable position, and your foot pegs are made out of rubber, so it completely removes a lot of the vibration. And you also have passenger foot pegs as well. One of the things I've seen people do is remove this rear passenger foot peg and just put some sort of adapter just to hold the exhaust. The rear passenger is actually pretty good. It's made out of this kind of like carbon fiber looking thimble. So it doesn't slide around, but it's a lot less comfortable than the previous Ninja 250. The previous Ninja 250 had a one-seater, and that one-seater was much more comfortable for long trips. But Kawasaki decided to make this more into a sport-oriented Ninja 250. I've never had any issues with comfort. I've ridden a Ninja 250 for very long periods, over like 600 miles, and it's just the nature of the sport bike. But the only thing, like, it's not so much the comfort of the seat that's bad, it's the high revving nature of the bike that wears you down if you're riding for sustained periods of time. The mirror stock is actually very small, so basically you're looking at your shoulders when you're looking back. It would help if Kawasaki extended it a little bit more, and that way you would be able to see behind. But the mirrors look great. Styling wise, Kawasaki did a great job in this new redesign of the Ninja 250. In my previous 08 Ninja 250, that's right, I've had 3 of these, I actually bought extenders that pushed it out a little bit, and that helped quite a bit. It's probably a great mod because I hate the fact that I would have to keep constantly be moving my shoulder just to look in the mirrors. It's not so much about riding, you know, like if you're riding twisties, you don't need to be constantly looking in the mirror. But if you're a commuter, and a lot of these bikes were used as commuter bikes, then you have to have mirrors just so it's a little bit safer. You need to see what's coming up from behind you. And this one only has 8,400 miles. The good thing about this particular Ninja 250 is that they put a fuel gauge on here. The previous Ninja 250s did not have that, so this is a nice touch. Now we're in 2020, this is a 2010. This is very antiquated. When you look at the new Ninja 300s, 400s, everything is much more digital, so this makes, looking back at this, this looks really antiquated, but at the time this was a very good option, especially that fuel gauge. Right here we have our ignition, and this one uses clip-ons, not handlebars, but they're very high up. Everybody thinks that because it's a sport bike you're going to be hunched over, but in reality it's a very upright bike. You can see that I am not, this is the way I would be riding it, and if I put my leg back you can see it's slightly angled. Most people think that you're going to be riding like this. Even like the most extreme bikes don't have such a big issue of being so leaned in. There are extreme bikes that do have a very leaned in position like Ducatis, but when you look at Ninja 250s like this, you can ride them for very long periods. And the old Ninja 250 was actually much more comfortable and much more touring oriented. This one is a much more sport bike oriented bike. And a lot of it has to do more with the styling and of course the 17-inch wheels that have helped it quite a bit. But the position is very ergonomically comfortable. You don't have a lot of wind protection, but this little windscreen does help to deflect some of the wind off of you. When you're looking at the mirrors, you see a lot of your shoulder, especially if you're using a jacket for protection. You're looking more at your shoulders. It's not a really great position. This should have been a little bit longer. Otherwise, the clip-ons feel very good. The fit and finish of this bike is really excellent. And when you consider that you can get these very inexpensive and you can learn to ride them and basically ride them, buy them for the same price that you sell them, because these Ninja 250s, they are always in demand. So one of the bad things about this Ninja 250, and I've ridden this for a lot, the old Ninja 250, the one that looks more squarish below 2007, I like the engine a little bit more, not because it was faster or older for some reason. Like I like that the valves were adjusted with a screw and nut. This one uses shim, so if you're going to adjust valves on this, this is a much more complex bike to work on. So it's not as good for the home mechanic. But other than that, the only other downside I see on this bike is it uses carburetors. And these carburetors seem to be really difficult to keep running. And I've had issues in my old Ninja 250. And I had to keep like cleaning them. So if you leave this bike unattended for a few months, it could be that the carburetor is going to get gummed up. And because it's such a small carburetor, it's very temperamental with the type of gas that you put in there. So if there's any debris in there, it could clog up the carburetor. And I did have issues with my previous Ninja 250 with the carburetors, so many of them that I decided to buy an extra set of carburetors, and I would just clean one and then put one in there. Also, this bike is not very good for the home mechanic. There's so much plastic, and a lot of it has more to do with the type of bike it is, a sport bike. So you have to remove all the plastic. Just to get to the carburetors, you have to remove all the plastic, the seat, that plastic, the gas tank, and then you have to take the plastic underneath here and slide it back, take the battery out, take the airbox and move it backwards. That's a really big process for a budget bike, because if people get this budget bike and they're new, they're going to take it to a dealer to do this, and they're going to charge you per hour for like $80 an hour. So in a way, if you don't know how to work on bikes, it's kind of a very expensive thing. When I had my old Ninja 250, I learned a lot about working on bikes because I was riding so much that I needed to work on my own bike. Otherwise, if I took it to a shop, it would cost way more money than the bike was worth to fix. But I never had any major problems with the engine or transmission in 87,000 miles. The only issue that I had was the carburetor. The carburetor flooding and then gas getting into the engine. So that's something to kind of look for on these bikes. And I did have an issue on this bike because this one is a 2010, and when I got it, there was gas in the engine because the carburetors, people kept starting it, and then gas kind of flowed into the engine. So there are issues with the bike. No bike is perfect, but I find that they did a good job in the new Ninja 300s by putting fuel injection, because that is what it needed. I wish they didn't go up in displacement, because I think that's a losing game, because you keep going up and up. And I think for a lot of riders, including me, having a 250, it's kind of cool because it's a small sport bike. It keeps your insurance lower as well. And it's just a much cooler bike to have than like a 400. At least I prefer it. When you think of the suspension, there's not a lot of adjustability for this bike. But there's also never any issues with this bike when it comes to suspension. It's adequate for a budget bike. In my old Ninja 250, I actually put a SV650 rear shock, and that actually raised up the rear a little bit, made it much more firmer. And I did put better suspension in the front, and that helped a lot. But when it comes to stock suspension, it's not the greatest if you intend on riding really, really hard. But most people that do ride twisties probably would opt for better suspension. It would be nice if it was more adjustable, but then again, you're buying a budget bike, you're not going to get those things. The seat height on this is really, really low. It's only like 29 inches, so this bike is really kind of nice for short riders, because physically when you sit on it, it is actually very small. And having a low seat height helps short riders and women riders a lot, and having a low weight. So you see a lot of people that are just starting out getting this. And one of the things that kind of is annoying is that a lot of people get this bike for a month or two, and then they think that they're good enough to go to a 600. But to me, like this bike, there's really nothing. You can ride this for years and years and always be surprised how good it is. It handles much better than a 600. And a lot of it has to do with egos that people have, that they're unwilling to ride a 250 mainly because other people ride other bikes. But to me, it's almost like a point of pride to ride something smaller. And even though I won't catch up with people on straightaways, I can almost catch up with people in twisty roads. The only problem, like if I catch up with people on twisty roads, it's difficult to pass them because they have so much more power. So, but just the ability of catching up to a GSXR 600 in a twisty road is kind of satisfying. And people might not realize it, but you have to work a lot harder to get this bike to move as fast as the 600. But also, most people that ride are not that good. Everybody likes to think that they're good, including me, but a Ninja 250 kind of humbles you a little bit. You know, it's not the type of bike that you would get if you had quite an ego on you because you're not going to win any races. You have to work harder. But in a way, it motivates you to be a better rider riding this thing than a GSX R1000, R1, R6, whatever. So one of the things that I keep getting asked by people is like, what is the top speed of this bike? And I've done a lot of top speed runs on Ninja 250s. The old Ninja 250 was actually faster in top speed than this one. This one is around like 95 miles per hour top speed. But if you read online, people say that you'll go 110, which is completely false. The speedo on this is really inaccurate, especially as you go higher in the speed, it just gets more inaccurate. So I measured this with the GPS many times and it's like 95 miles an hour, maybe 96 going downhill. And I've gotten that same sort of weird reaction. People actually think that the top speed is much higher than what it is. When I had an R1, you know, I hit like 190 something miles an hour, but the actual top speed of the R1 was much lower. I believe it's like 167, 170 miles an hour. So keep that in mind, 95 miles an hour top speed. But people don't get Ninja 250s for top speed. If you're getting a bike for top speed, you're picking the wrong machine for it. Don't get a Ninja 250. This bike is really good just for like low-end city riding and twisty riding. And it's a fun bike. That's the thing that I can't emphasize enough. These small bikes, they're not these bikes that are super fast, but they're just as fun as a big bike. It's just a different sort of like mentality. Like you can have fun in a scooter. Scooters are just as fun, but this thing feels like a very light bicycle of a sport bike, if that makes any sense. It's very basic. It doesn't have any of the frills of the new sport bike with modes. It's a really good bike, and I've seen a lot of guys use this for racing. Don't get this bike for top speed. There's no point. This is a bike that you get just for twisty riding. It's almost like the type of bike that if you're really crazy for twisty riding or you're a beginner, this is a perfect bike for you. I can see a lot of people that are into the science of motorcycle riding getting this just for perfecting their technique and then getting on another bike and using the things that they learned on this bike on that other bike. So when it comes to the home mechanic, I've never thought this bike was great for the home mechanic. It's not that it's unreliable, it's that you always have to kind of work on it a little bit because the carburetors, like I said before, they just kind of keep going out of adjustment. They need cleaning often, and I found that sometimes in the winter it was hard to start because of the carburetors. If you ride anywhere, I'm in the DC metro area, so in the winter as it gets cold, and I rode this bike through snow, through ice, and it was very hard starting. Also, if you're a commuter, it doesn't have a lot of power for electrical components. So if you're going to be running an electric vest, gloves and stuff like that, I found that I can run maybe gloves and a jacket, but I would have to turn it off once in a while because it would drain the battery. So it doesn't have a lot of great power for electrical components, but the carburetor is really like the worst thing about it. But a lot of guys prefer carburetors because you can adjust them easily without taking them to the shops. I'm more of the type of person that would prefer fuel injection. I think it's a better idea. And also, if you're a home mechanic, you're gonna have to remove a lot of plastic to get to the parts that need to be fixed. The carburetor requires a lot of plastic to be removed. To get to the air filter, it's this cover, it's just one bolt and this kind of pops out, and then there's 4 additional bolts under here and you pull out the filter to clean, so that's accessible. Under the seat is where the battery is, but you have to pull this out and then 2 bolts on each side. I would prefer it to be a little bit simpler, having some sort of like switch that doesn't require bolts. But that's just me. I prefer things to be simple for maintenance. But this bike taught me a lot about working on bikes. After I had this bike, I actually bought a V-Strom 650, and the V-Strom 650 made me more of a lazy type of mechanic. It never required any maintenance, but otherwise 87,000 miles and pretty much maintenance free. And a lot of people would say, oh yeah, 87,000 miles. You know, my FJR 1300's got 120,000 miles. Yeah, but your FJR 1300 is a 1300cc bike. So generally, a smaller engine bike like this, it gets much more stress with much more miles that you put on it. And it's very difficult to put a lot of miles on this thing because you can go for 100 miles and it does feel like you've gone 200 miles. Another big benefit of this bike is that when you're riding this thing, if you're going 50 miles an hour, it feels like you're going 100. And it's a psychological like manipulation on the bike's part, but that's a good way because the reason I bought a Ninja 250 is that I kept getting reckless speeding tickets and I kept getting like tickets for going really fast. And I sold my ST 1300 by Honda. That's a 1300cc sport touring bike because I kept getting speeding tickets because the ST 1300 had the opposite problem that this has. You would be going 100, but it felt like you were going like 30 miles an hour. This is the complete opposite. So it's difficult to get speeding tickets on this. I did get pulled over by a cop in West Virginia that claimed I was going 120 miles an hour on this. And a lot of it has to do with ignorance and lying because this bike can't go 120 miles an hour. He just saw this bike as being a sport bike and he wanted to pull me over. And that's another thing too, because the way this bike looks, it's a sport bike, and to the uninitiated, it looks like a 1000cc crotch rocket, and people will give you tickets. But the problem is it's also hard to get tickets on it because it's such a slow bike. A lot of times I feel like I'm going 100 and I look down, I'm going like 60. And honestly, on the highway, I like to go 65 on it. I don't like to go too fast because it's revved so high, and I prefer to keep my revs a little bit lower. It's a very high revving engine, and in a way, that makes it much more fun to ride in the twist. So up front, in the front wheel, you only have one single disc to stop the bike, and you would think that somehow that this disc brake would not be good enough, but for the Ninja 250, it's strong enough, and it doesn't feel like you need any more braking power in this bike. All right, let's start this bike up so you can hear it roar. That's a cold start. Alright, what kind of review would it be if I didn't show you how the bike rode? And even though you might be riding slow, you're still having fun. And at the end of the day, it's really not about speed. It's about having fun on a motorcycle. And I think what a Ninja 250 gives you is that basic feeling, that same type of feeling that when you first got on a motorcycle, that feeling of like the wind rushing through. It wasn't a complex machine with all of this electronics. It was a simple machine. Twisties, this bike is perfect. And I'm not really going too fast, but in any sort of like twisty condition, this is where the bike really shines. It's not like highway riding or straightaway riding. This bike is not meant for that. This bike is a really good, very tight corner twisty sort of bike because it just goes around corners like it's a bicycle. It's such a fun bike for the twisties, but it's torture on the highway. And don't get me wrong, I've done a lot of highway riding on my Ninja 250s, but I feel like, man, this bike just shines in the twisties because it's so maneuverable. Alright guys, that is my Ninja 250. I really like this bike. But, you know, it could be a bike that's not for everybody. I know that I have weird tastes when it comes to motorcycles, but this thing is really fun. And the best thing, you can get them like really cheap, ride them for a year and sell them for the same price, because there's always a demand for Ninja 250s. All right, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.